It's our pleasure today to speak with the Honourable OWEN, the representative for St.Peter, Member of Parliament. Mr. Arthur, this interview today is coming against the backdrop of the announcement by the Finance Minister last Friday of the impending layoffs of approximately 3,000 civil servants in the first instance by the government as it seeks to deal with what has been a really gaping hole in our economy.
I fundamentally believe that a convention should apply, that a former Prime Minister should be seldom seen and seldom heard, but that when he's seen or heard, it should be on a matter of the most important and imposing national significance. So I'm choosing today to effectively break a silence and not to defy a convention. And I'm doing so because our country is in peril. I'm also speaking against the backdrop of statements made by Ms. Motley, Leader of the Opposition, and Mr. Kerry Simmons this weekend in response to the situation. But when I say the country is in peril, it is not only because there's a, as you call it, a gaping crisis in this country, but the response to the government is frightening and would indicate that rather than deal fundamentally with the issue at hand, the government wants to stifle and silence its critics as the means of having its way. Mr. Stewart yesterday said that his government is not going to let nurse nor coddle their critics. This comes against the backdrop of, if it was just an isolated statement, no problem. But it come against the backdrop of a statement by the Minister of Education that the government was going to break the heads of its critics and unleash the army on them. It come against the backdrop of journalists in the country being led away to answer charges for writing stories. And last week, again, we had another situation where there is the appearance that the government wants to deal with this matter by silencing their critics. I recently said that the only thing that is necessary for the triumph of wickedness is for good people to do nothing. And the crisis that is facing this, or the peril that is facing this country, is that we have an imposing crisis, but that the government wants to deal with it in a tyrannical way. And I break my silence to let those persons know that they should treat with the threats of the Prime Minister, that they're not going to coddle their critics, nor they're not going to, we were in the nurse them, that they should treat them with the same disdain. That his statement that he was going to break the heads of the level, that they should treat it with the same disdain. There's a fundamental issue that we must all treat to at this time. There's a calamity facing this country. The calamity must be dealt with. How we got into this calamity we can discuss. But a process must be followed in the midst of this calamity to indicate that the government wants to govern in a just way. 3,500 Barbadians are now living in a state of siege. It's a serious matter. We are on the eve of Christmas. They do not know whether they're going to have a livelihood next year. To put people under this circumstance, in this situation, is to put their lives in a state of contingency. But they do not know what next is to come. Mr. Simmons has raised a very fundamental problem, a fundamental issue. The government has a duty in the face of this calamity, to spell out clearly the process that they are going to follow in addressing this most difficult matter of dismissing 3,500 people in the first instance. There are conventions that apply. There are practices, best practices that are followed in instances like this. But to leave 3,500 people who are breadwinners and 3,500 Barbadian families in a situation where they have to face this uncertainty without clarity being brought to the process and fairness being assured is to in fact deepen the wound. When Mr. Stewart therefore spoke, there was the hope that he would have responded to Mr. Simmons by saying, this is how we propose to deal with the matter. And we are going to give you the assurance that only the most objective circumstances will be taken into account. He sought to deal with it by way of the threats again. That no, he's not going to coddle nor veterinarians his critics, and that is totally unsatisfactory. And therefore we must speak. We must tell the government that the 3,500 people who are now to be laid off are victims. There are a lot of things, other things that the government can do to give them the assurance that fairness will surround their being put in this situation. The government, for example, this government can't expect that fairness obtains if 3,500 people are dismissed. But the response of the cabinet is that they cut their wages. They will still continue to enjoy an income. And perhaps Mr. Stewart, rather than tell us that he was going to cut their wages, he should have told us that he has the largest cabinet in the history of Barbados. He has the most ineffective cabinet. And that part of the response to the fiscal situation is that some of them were going to be dismissed as well too. I must tell you, I've already said that the wages paid to some of the ministers are a cost overrun, and that should be addressed. There are a number of financial arrangements that this government has been following that have also led to the financial crisis. At a time, for example, when people are being laid off, the most outrageous set of concessions have been granted by the government. That has to stop. We are also aware that contracts have been arranged without tendering, involving a massive waste of money. The government has committed itself to a number of projects for which there's no justification. We need to be made assured that these things will stop. This is a moment as well that will put the labour movement of Barbados on trial. For 14 years as the Prime Minister, I tried to practice the politics of inclusion, where I had the labour movement involved in every fundamental matter facing this country. But the credibility of the labour movement is now being put on trial. And why? In 2010, speaking on National Heroes Day, I indicated that the labour movement and the government had agreed to a wage freeze, and the labour movement had given a mandate to Shop Stewart to tell the workers they were making no announcements. They contested what they said in public and said that they was lying. Not only has there been a wage freeze since 2010, but it is about to be extended as well. In 2008, I believe that the labour movement made itself available to be purchased by agreeing with the government that the labour movement support could have been secured by the promise of duty-free cars and interest-free mortgages. That had nothing to do with the welfare of the workers. It is absolutely clear that the pressure comes not so much from the opposition, but from the labour movement, for the government to spell out with crystal clarity how it proposes to get rid of 1 in 10 public servants, and that it must insist that the government follows best practices and policies spelled out in international conventions in dealing with these matters. My greatest concern as well is that, yes, the government must deal with its fiscal problem. But I want to repeat something that I've been saying for a while now, that we are in danger of living in a society that does not have a viable economy. There is a fiscal problem facing this country that must be addressed. But we now have an economy that is totally dysfunctional. Generally, it takes at least 3 sectors of the economy functioning properly to ensure growth in this country. We have now a situation where no sector of the economy is either not only functioning, but it's growing. And that there's going to be no solution unless the government does what needs to be done. And I addressed this matter in a recent lecture. Bringing about growth in the economy and addressing the fiscal situation as part and parcel of one coherent process. This situation is going to get deeper and deeper if the absence of a competitive private sector, growing economy, if this is not addressed in a fundamental way. You cannot have a society unless you have a viable economy. And I wish I didn't have to say so, but the tourism sector is in decline. Manufacturing sector, agricultural sector, construction sector. Barbados has no viable future if it has no viable economy. And it is important that we speak now to tell the government that, yes, you have to address the fiscal situation, but it can't be a standalone, one-off situation. It has to be in the context of a set of arrangements where you can bring about economic growth to help you deal with the fiscal situation as well. That has been the missing element. we be pressing the Labour Party to keep saying what we will do. 3 years ago, as the leader of the opposition speaking of the budget, I told the government, and it might be too late now to keep telling them, that the hardest thing to do in a democracy is to cut people's entitlements. And that we urge that a task force should have been put in place, and that we should seek to develop a consensus as to how the matter should have been addressed. In much the same way that maybe we had to reform the social security system of Barbados. We said that we can't act unilaterally. This is going to require very difficult choices. Put a task force in place and let us find the best way of dealing. We said that 3 years ago.
But will the task force work now if we're in crisis?
Well, let me say this. I think we've reached a stage now where the government has to be as much focusing on how to get the economy to grow again as to just making the cuts. Because I feel unless we get that done, what is happening now is just going to be the first installment of a tragedy.
So this won't solve the problems? These 3,500
No.
won't solve the problem?
Because I will tell you, the bigger problem out there that is not being addressed is that you have an economy that is no longer viable. Barbados' economy is not viable if no sector is growing. I recently gave a lecture where I spoke about the strategic options facing this country. I acknowledge that the government doesn't have a lot of fiscal space by which to stimulate the economy. But there's a lot of enablers and drivers that Barbados can use to change the way in which the economy is functioning, to bring about growth. I would urge you to go back to it again. For example, Barbados now has the worst conditions for doing business in the Eastern Caribbean. We are now ranked, I think, 91st, 3 places down from last year. All the countries like St. Lucia, others have better conditions for doing business. A lot of our economic sectors depend upon conditions for doing business. The international business sector, 2,700 jobs were lost, $2 billion because of doing business conditions. Change the conditions for doing business. If you read our manifesto, I indicated that that was going to be our first priority. That was going to establish a business facilitation unit in the Prime Minister's office and move Barbados from where it is to where it must be, among the top 10 places. Because if we don't do that, the sectors are not going to come back. Barbados is falling behind in IT. A lot of economic growth in the rest of the world is generated by IT. You've got to do that. Barbados needs a new enterprise culture. What the government has done is use these one-off concessions to a privileged few. That is recognition that people cannot make returns on their investments. Hence, enterprises cannot grow, nor new ones be created. It needs to reverse many of the policies that stop enterprises from being able to focus. Take tourism. If you increase water rates by 60%, electricity prices by 65%, increase the excise tax by 50%, increase property taxes, increase the value-added tax, you're going to carry a leading sector. And my last budget presentation tell the government, look, we have to do what is necessary now to let tourism succeed. Now, in 1971, this country had a sugar industry, and in 1971, sugar industry stopped the sugar industry from being a leading sector. This government policies have stopped tourism from being able to drive the Barbados economy. Change those policies. They can't do it for one entity. There has to be a balanced approach to reversing those policies. So rather than give everything to one, make the adjustment for all. Barbados cannot come out of this crisis unless we address and let tourism sector be the leading sector in the way it has to be. Again, the international business sector in Barbados, by their own admission, has floundered because of the unwillingness of the government to change the conditions on the business is done. And this is not my statistics. Their own records show that 2,700 jobs were lost purely because of dithering and bureaucracy.
So you're saying bad policy got us where we are right now?
Yeah, but and in part, enlargement. And I'm not going to say that the government has not faced difficult circumstances, but in the rest of the world, there are countries that have faced difficult circumstances, they're pressing ahead with their development. And you ask me some things that we think they should do, that they should, as this is, reverse the policies, not for one, but for all, to allow the tourism sector really to lead. I cannot conceive of a growth strategy to Barbados that does not have at its core making the tourism sector viable. The government policies have made tourism enterprises not being able to make returns. That's why the sector is failing. Change those, but do it across the board rather than for one. Change the business facilitation processes. Carry Barbados to a new IT. We have to do that. I also spoke in my lecture about how important it has been for us in Barbados to get the regional economy going. We depend more upon the regional economy than any other Caribbean economy. 50% of our exports, $500 million in re-exports, 10% of our tourism. Barbados is the country that benefits most from the regional arrangements and services. Why do we put it on pause? A growing regional economy benefits Barbados. And I could go on and on and on. And the point I'm making is that we have no crisis in this country. And the people of Barbados are resourceful. They are willing to live in and want to live in a successful society. The government has to mobilize them to raise up their own economic self-defense. But not to do that is wasting time. I also believe that the government has now to adopt a new paradigm. And my regrets about this last election campaign is that we sought, quite frankly, to try to engage in a serious discussion. But I was frustrated by the government using a lot of putrid tactics. The government has to carry a program of fiscal consolidation. We felt that if you have to do that, and we can talk about why you have to do it, then create the conditions under which the private sector can expand, but the public sector consolidates. So that things that have historically been in the realm of the public sector, we felt that you should create the environment within which the private sector can go into them. If you read our manifesto, we spoke in terms of fiscal regime for social transformation. So that if you have to adjust healthcare in Barbados has largely been a private matter, you know. My grandparents had their own doctors. Let people be able to claim tax credits for investing in health insurance and whatever else, and be able to offset to buy some of the healthcare, from the private sector. I have also, as you know, favored the introduction of the modification of the tertiary education arrangements to allow people to save for their children education and benefit from a tax concession. But the key is, healthcare and education in Barbados can be growth areas for the private sector. Create an enabling environment within which they can happen so that you don't cut with nothing positive coming out of it. You cut, but you stimulate the private sector to take your place. Okay, but these things can be done.
Mm-hmm. What about, do you support then, are the cuts necessary at this stage? Would you say they're necessary?
Let me put it this way. I am always one who believes that prevention is better than cure. And that all through we have been warning the government now for 4 years that the current account deficit was unmanageable. The current account deficit only became a deficit in 2008. And even while the deficit was existing and growing, the government kept adding and adding and adding to public sector employment. When Chris Sinclair said that he had to borrow to pay the wages of 7,000 people, his response then was not to stop employing them, but to add to it. And I have you asked me a very good question. I am having to defend myself. Myself, Clyde Maskell, Tyrone Barker, and Anthony Wood. We've had to go to court. Mr. Chris Sinclair made a charge leading up to the election that the four of us had met at University of the West Indies and had come up with a secret plan to cut 10,000 Barbados shops. We felt so strongly about it because, first of all, it was based on malicious foundations. There was no such secret plan. And we would have sought to, for 14 years as a minister, I sought to show our Minister of the Country's Affairs, rather than cutting employment, to add employment. So that I'm not the person who's going to agree that there should be cuts in the employment. But I'm saying that the government has not exhausted the other ways of saving expenditures. And before it comes to cuts, and it may eventually have to come to that, do all the other things that are necessary stop the asking the public to pay for the political program of the Democratic Labour Party. The very week that the Minister of Finance announced that he's sending over 4,000 people, the government is spending money on a David Thompson's Memorial Football. Cut out that. What are the two biggest supplementaries that have been brought to Parliament in this year? One in March and one recently, when the government says it doesn't have money. Expenditures for summer camps. These things are means by which the Democratic Labour Party is feeding the appetite of its own supporters for contracts. Perhaps what I'm trying to get to is that this is not the last resort. The government still wants to perpetuate the use of the taxpayers' funds to support its partisan political program. It has to address that first. And I don't think it should be asking anybody to carry the sacrifice unless the Democratic Labour Party itself is prepared to do the sacrifice.
You also said cut the size of the cabinet. You described it as ineffective and too large, the largest in Barbados' history. Who would you dismiss?
Well, I was talking from there. And the salary to him is a cost overrun. And I say that not facetiously. Look, there has never been in our history a greater challenge to a Prime Minister than that which came from the Eager 11. But that was not isolated. A large part of our problem right now is the fiscal indiscipline. And Fernando Stewart finds himself in a position that no other Prime Minister has ever found himself in, to face a threat from within his cabinet. And in order to stave off, to hold onto his position, he has had to allow people to have their own way. The thing that I need to say, when I see this debushing program in Barbados now, crash program, it takes me back to my years in Jamaica. Remember what happened in Jamaica leading up to the Holocaust? Michael Malley introduced the bauxite levy, but had a crash program where people said, no, she was in Barbados. 2007, I did two things as the Prime Minister of this country. People brought me up the notion that we should have also had. Government has about 60 bushing programs already. Brought my cabinet that we should have another one. I says no. But even in 2007 budget, I made it very clear that Barbados has reached a stage where we could have no new entitlements, no new freedness programs or anything of these kinds. Now, that was my position in 2007. And if we had followed that approach, we would not now be in this. And what this is telling us right now, is that you do not let these problems happen and then try to solve them. And here comes the question. We have built our country on stability. That's our greatest economic asset. That stability has been expressed in our commitment to a fixed exchange rate that allows people to make investment and economic decisions with a relative certainty about the future. The maintenance of a fixed exchange rate requires fiscal discipline. And that has been expressed by me and others over and over again. Every time this country has departed from fiscal discipline, we're going to put our stability in peril. And we are going to put that exchange rate in peril. No, this is coming now. This is now coming. This crisis now is coming. Mm-hmm. This crisis now is more prolonged than other crises in the past. In the other crises in the past, you've had a V-shaped situation, a decline, upturn. Mm-hmm. Now, this is a spiral downwards. Devaluation is a policy decision that our government has to make, and I would rather not be the person who is speculating about it. But what I can tell you is this, that you've exhausted most of the options. When I give that lecture, I drew Barbados' attention to a paper that was done on notions of devaluations. There are three concepts. One is internal devaluation, where you allow the wage rate. You try to make yourself more competitive by reducing real wages. In 1991, that's what was used, an internal devaluation. And the world pleaded for it again. Mm-hmm. Barbados has already had an effective real devaluation, internal devaluation, because wages have been frozen, but prices have risen by 30-something%. So wages have fallen. There's a thing called fiscal devaluations, where you try to change the conditions under which business obtains by making them more competitive with taxpayers. The government is doing that in part, but it has done it in a way that doesn't allow it to do it across the board, but only for a select few. So it virtually has exhausted that.
Would you be willing to take a salary cut? I know that they've talked about 10% cut for MPs on the government
I'm
side?
I'm waiting for the government to do that, which is fair. That if it's going to send home people, send home some of its ministers.
So how many ministers you're talking about here?
At least 10% of the cap. No, no more than 10% of the cap. No, a few should go home. And that is the reality. That you can't tell others to go home and keep the largest bureaucracy in the history, the largest cabinet in the history of Barbados. But our approach has now to be serious. No tokenism, no. This crisis is real peril. As I said, is because you have a fiscal crisis coexisting with an economy that is no longer viable. When you evaluate the number of enterprises in tourism that have closed, that's our leading sector. When your leading sector fails, your economy fails. The tourism sector don't only generate 15% of our GDP, It affects 60% of the economy. So fix tourism. And if the government was talking about those things in a systematic way, then the other things you're talking about will add value. But the government is not addressing the core issues. And believe me, this crisis is now of a nature that I'm worried. I live in a country that had faced crisis. I lived in Jamaica in the 1970s, But Jamaica had a lot to fall back upon. Barbados, in Jamaica's case, we still had a large subsistence economy. Still does. So that when I visited my mother-in-law in Point Hill, St. Catherine, people in Point Hill, St. Catherine were not fully aware that there was a crisis in West Jamaica, because they were doing on-account production. They caught fish from the river or whatever else. They only contact with they grow their own coffee, their own cocoa, and live in simple circumstances. But their economy was still largely a subsistence economy. So a large part of the economy was shielded from the adversity of the crisis. Barbados has evolved an economy that has increasingly become a commercial economy. There's no longer a subsistence on activity. There's not a lot to fall back on. You go to Guyana, it's the same thing. Mm-hmm. You see it in St. Vincent. People have something to fall back on. The reason why you have to get the whole economy going again is because we have become a sophisticated commercial economy. People do not have anything to fall back on. And that is the real nature of the crisis.
How much of this is your fault, Mr. Arthur? You and the Barbados Labour Party?
For not winning the last election and for not forcing the government. I wish, and I'm going to be candid with you. I tried in 14 years to run the country as properly as I could. Our very last year in government was our best economic year. In 2007, when they presented my last budget, really, I said no more entitlements. The things that they have done that I would not do. I, for example, would not have granted, and I may candid with you, could not have afforded many of these new programs that the Democratic Party introduced. For 14 years, when I heard that we didn't reform the economy, I'm amused. I found an economy in 1994 that was emerging from crisis. The government of the day had agreed to join the WTO. That was going to change the fortunes of agriculture and manufacturing in fundamental ways. We had to apply WTO rules. We had to face the threat of the OECD. We had to fit the Barbados economy into the CSME and stave off threats. And we found a way to get the economy growing at 3% per year, reduced unemployment from 24% to 6%, left reserves. I thought that had put the situation of our reserves beyond the point where they have become a threat again. In our last year in government, we attracted $1.5 billion in foreign capital, private foreign capital. I remember when I spoke about Barbados having to increase the ratio of foreign capital to GDP, there were people who were saying they were trying to sell out the country. And so I'm not holding myself blameless, but I really did try my very, very best, and it was candid in dealing with the country.
Fendel would argue he's trying his best.
Fendel is now trying to wrap himself in a cloak of righteousness. That he's a man more sinned against than sinning. And that he and his government have been innocent bystanders in all of this. The truth is that if we in the Labour Party had not been urging, let us cooperate with you to try to find national consensus with dealing with this, I could accept it. And if we for 4 years have not been telling the government, You cannot run a current account deficit. You're not hearing this for the first time, you know. This has been our mantra. You don't let it happen and then try to solve it, preempt it from happening. Then, finally, it's not get less. But he has been at the center of it. And it is wrong. You don't get a fiscal problem because of global recession. You get a fiscal problem because of deliberate decisions made by the government of a country. And most of the fiscal decisions were in the nature of expanding employment, especially at the election, or supporting political programs that they know were going to, like, we had situations where ministers through the constituency councils paying bills and whatever else. The Democratic Party understood very clearly that the things when bad policies can be good politics. And Barbados has become a victim of that. And Front Stewart has been at the center of it. But I'm also telling you that he has a peculiar responsibility. He is the Prime Minister who faced that challenge from the Eagle 11 and is not in a position to really impose the kind of fiscal discipline on his own.
So you're saying what, step aside for now? What are you saying?
Kind of giving him advice, but what I'm telling him, stop threatening those people who are going to be his critics. Because this is the point I'm making. That he kept saying, I'm doing these things because I'm congratulate me, because I'm pursuing these policies, because I'm trying to protect jobs. Now that you have to send home 3,000 people, don't ask to be congratulated. And don't threaten people who tell you in front of them, if you have to send home these 3,000, send home somebody your own first, and stop doing some of the political things that you're doing.
But you have threatened people when you were Prime Minister.
I have to.
Yeah?
But not by sending them, not by putting them
into handcuffs?
No, but a Prime Minister's job can be very lonely. You have to be the chief defender of the tribe. And, you know, sometimes you have to talk tougher than you are.
So what is your job? What is your role in getting Barbados out of this situation?
You know, as I gave a lecture, I spoke to our strategic options. There are consequences for elections. When you lose an election, a government has to govern. I can only tell the country what the strategic options are. And I will keep doing that. And I signaled when I gave that lecture in November that my contribution to the country said, these are our strategic options. You may not want to accept them, but these are your options. I will no longer remain silent. I will speak on the issues. I try to restrain myself, and I'm not here vying for office. I represent the people of ST.PETER and their suffering. But also, I feel motivated to speak when the response of the government is tyranny. I'm believing that's why I'm speaking in this way. That Mr. Stewart should have come and tell the country, look, we are doing this, but they also want to do other things that give you hope. I speak to hope as well. I feel that the economy can be made to grow. And if you lessen the burden of the fiscal adjustment by paying back growth, because without growth, you can't get it done. So that there's hopelessness being sowed. And if you sow hopelessness is doom is going to be the result. So that the Prime Minister of the country has to speak, to mobilize his people, to draw upon their resourcefulness and their resilience in their own self-defense. And he has, and the beautiful thing about leading a small country is that there's only a few key strategic things that you have to do. As Prime Minister, I didn't have to be bothered about our nuclear arms, nor where our Navy was. But you do the few key things. And right now, in Barbados' case, the leading sector cannot lead. Fix it. That sounds simple, but it is the key. Tourism affects 60% of this economy. These enterprises in the tourism sector are failing because enterprises cannot exist, expand, or do one's created if they can't make returns. The government policies have stopped enterprises in tourism from being able to be viable. Change those, but do it across the board rather than for the selective one or two. Do that. Make it happen. And give the country a chance to succeed. The international business sector should also have been addressed. But those that do that and do it properly. And come away from the madness that you can have a fiscal solution to this fiscal crisis. There may be no fiscal solution to the crisis unless it's also growth. Nobody in the government is talking about serious growth. And that's where I would have been concentrating my effort. And I said that as much in the lecture. So I will continue to talk to the country about what I call these incoherence. It's incoherent. And that it can be done. There are other small countries that are facing our situation, you know, and they're trying their very best. And if you read my lecture, I'm not telling them to do impossible things, you know. Why can't we just make it Singapore in terms of business facilitation? I read a manifesto. I said I would have had the unit for business facilitation in the Prime Minister's office. That we are 98, 91st in terms of doing business. Things like registering property and so on, it takes too long, too expensive. It don't cost anything. But every month, I will set the benchmarks to bring us to world standards. Every month, the unit will take the results from ministries. Where are you with this? How long does it take you to register property and so on? Change the conditions for doing business. Change the enterprise culture. Let enterprises be able to. You have reverse those policies. Let enterprises be able. This enterprise called Barbados today will not exist forever if people cannot make a return on their investment. And the Barbadian public has been told that growth, poverty eradication, employment creation comes from two sources only. The expansion of existing enterprises, the existence of existing enterprises, and the creation of new ones. And those things only happen if you have enterprises that can make returns. When the government reaches a stage where its policies are stopping enterprises from making a return,